Welcome to The Explainer. In August of 2025, we saw this absolute whirlwind of high-stakes diplomacy, stretching all the way from Alaska to Washington, D.C., and it was all aimed at one thing: ending the war in Ukraine. But, instead of forging unity, this intense push for peace seems to have done the exact opposite, exposing a really deep and troubling divide across the Atlantic.
Okay, so let's get right into it. To really understand the fractures that started to appear, you first have to get a grip on the timeline of these meetings, because they happened fast. It all kicked off on August 15th, with a major face-to-face between Presidents Trump and Putin up in Alaska. Then, just 3 days later, the whole show moves to D.C. That's where President Zelensky and a group of European leaders were, summoned to the White House. And then, in a pretty stunning move, Trump actually takes a 40-minute call with Putin while that D.C. meeting is going on. The very next day, the Europeans regrouped to try and figure out their own path forward.
So here's how we're going to break this all down today. We're going to look at 6 key parts of this story to see how this push for peace might have actually revealed a huge divide. We'll start with Trump's strategy, then the very different welcomes the leaders got, the competing ideas of what peace even looks like, the massive puzzle of security guarantees, Russia's point of view, and finally, what does all this mean for the Western alliance?
All right, let's start with President Trump's big move here, because this really set the stage for everything else that happened. This was, without a doubt, an attempt to grab the reins of the peace process and drive it to a conclusion his way.
So this is absolutely crucial. After that meeting in Alaska, the White House's approach did a complete 180. The goal wasn't just about getting a ceasefire to get people talking anymore, which, by the way, had been the European and Ukrainian position. Nope. The new American priority was a big, comprehensive, final peace deal, a long-term, stable, and reliable result. And that one shift completely changed the game.
But what's really fascinating here isn't just the policy, it's the optics. In diplomacy, how things look can be just as important as what's being said. And the way these two meetings were staged sent incredibly powerful, and probably intentional, messages about who was valued and who wasn't.
Just look at this side by side. For Putin in Alaska, it's the full VIP treatment. Red carpet, a personal greeting from the president, a ride in the limo. For Zelensky and the Europeans in Washington, it was described by people who were there as a public humiliation. What kind of message does it send when an ally, President Zelensky, feels you have to thank President Trump 11 times in just 4.5 minutes? It tells you a lot about the power dynamic in that room.
And this brings us right to the heart of the matter. We're not talking about the conflict on the battlefield anymore. We're talking about the one at the negotiating table. Because when the key players say the word peace, it turns out they all mean wildly different things. It's not one vision for ending the war, it's 3, and they're all competing with each other.
This table just lays it out so clearly. Let's just run through it. On NATO membership for Ukraine, President Trump says it's absolutely not on the agenda. Europe says it's an irreversible path, but maybe not right now. And for Russia, it's a hard no, a fundamental red line. On territory, the U.S. seems to expect Ukraine to give some up, but for countries like France and Germany, legally recognizing seized land is a non-starter. And even on a ceasefire, they're not on the same page. Germany says it has to happen before talks, but now both the U.S. and Russia see it as part of a final deal, not step 1.
So let's say, just for a second, they somehow hammer out a peace deal. What happens next? What stops this from all happening again in 5 or 10 years? That is the billion-dollar question. What do these so-called security guarantees actually look like?
First, let's just quickly define our terms so we're all on the same page. A security guarantee is basically a formal promise. It's one or more countries committing to protect another one if it gets attacked. You can think of it like an insurance policy against another war.
And the ideas for what that insurance policy could look like are, they're all over the mat. The U.S. has drawn a very clear line. Maybe some air cover, some intelligence help, but absolutely no American boots on the ground, period. On the flip side, you have powers like the U.K. and France floating the idea of actually putting their own troops inside Ukraine as a tripwire. And then there's Russia's condition for any of this, which is a demand for equal guarantees for its own security, which is basically a giant veto on any foreign troops getting near its border.
Now, to really understand this whole puzzle, you have to try and see it from Moscow's perspective. And from their point of view, they aren't coming to the table as the weaker party, far from it. They believe they're negotiating from a position of strength and, in their eyes, righteous historical grievance.
A huge piece of Moscow's argument starts with economics. They love to point to this number 1 right here. It represents their economy's rank as the largest in Europe, but only when you measure it by something called purchasing power parity, which accounts for cost of living. So, to them, this proves that despite almost 30,000 sanctions, Western economic pressure has failed. And that gives them, in their minds, the upper hand.
And to really get why the Kremlin feels the way it does, you have to understand the European view they're constantly pushing back against. Take this quote from French President Macron. He doesn't see Russia as a difficult partner, he sees them as a permanent ogre at our gates, a fundamental threat.
And then, as a direct response to that worldview, you get this from Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. He calls the European arguments about why the war started puerile. That's a fancy word for childish. He's basically saying that Europe is dishonestly ignoring what Russia considers decades of provocation. You just can't find two more diametrically opposed viewpoints.
So, after all of this, where does it leave the Western alliance? This big diplomatic push, which you'd think would create unity, seems to have done the opposite. It's just widened the cracks that were already there between the US and its European allies. So what's the fallout? Well, you've got the US and Europe running on separate diplomatic tracks that sometimes even conflict. Russia, of course, is pouring gasoline on that fire, praising the US approach while trashing the Europeans. And maybe most importantly, you're starting to hear European leaders talk openly about a strategic awakening, this idea that they might need to handle their own security without relying on Washington. So after this diplomatic storm, after all the different agendas and the growing divides, we're really left with one critical question, aren't we? Was any of this a genuine breakthrough for peace? Or was it the beginning of a historic breakdown of the transatlantic alliance?
And maybe that's the final thought to leave you with. In this unbelievably high-stakes game of diplomacy, where the major Western powers aren't even reading from the same page anymore, the biggest question of all might just be, with the West is divided, who actually holds the winning hand?